In the shadows of America's darkest past, some stories were whispered only at night, stories that mixed cruelty with the supernatural and pain with an unexplainable hunger for justice. Among the countless tragedies of the 1800s, few were as chilling, as mysterious, or as feared as the tale you're about to hear. This is not just history. It is a haunting reminder that even in the deepest suffering, something unearthly can awaken. The overseer's cruelty was not the kind that burst suddenly like a storm, but the kind that settled slowly and permanently, like rot in old wood. He carried it with him in every step, every command, every cold look thrown toward the workers who feared his voice more than the crack of his whip. His authority was absolute, and he reminded everyone of it through methods that made the strongest men grit their teeth and the youngest children hide behind whatever they could find. Yet behind that rigid posture and cold, sharpened stare was something far darker, an enjoyment he tried to hide but could not completely mask. His cruelty was not duty, it was appetite, fed by the helplessness of those beneath him. And with every passing month, the plantation grew quieter, as if the land itself was holding its breath, knowing something was coming. Eli, the boy who would one day become the center of the plantation's whispered terror, felt that cruelty more closely than most. The overseer targeted him with a kind of fixation, perhaps because Eli did not react the way the man expected. Pain never made him scream. Punishment never made him beg. The boy simply stared with an unsettling calm that made the overseer clench his jaw and look away faster than he meant to. It was not defiance. It was not resistance. It was something colder, something unreadable, something that unsettled even the man who prided himself on fearing nothing. The workers noticed how the overseer's hand would pause before delivering a strike, or how he lingered a second too long when Eli lifted his head and met his eyes. Some claimed they saw the boy whisper under his breath afterward, not in prayer, not in fear, but in a low tone like someone remembering the words to something ancient. As the overseer's cruelty escalated, the air around the plantation began to shift. Nightfall brought with it strange gusts of wind that should not have existed in the still Alabama heat. Workers awoke to the sound of rustling where nothing moved, tapping on the walls when no one was inside, and voices that seemed to echo from beneath the earth instead of above it. The overseer dismissed all of it as foolish superstition, but even he began to feel the atmosphere pressing down on him, thick and heavy, especially when Eli was near. The boy's presence seemed to twist the air, make the shadows feel longer, make the wind blow in unnatural directions. More than once, the overseer snapped his head around, certain someone was behind him, only to find an empty room or an open field. No matter how tightly he gripped his lantern, the light never seemed to reach as far when Eli passed by. The workers whispered in secret about the strange shift in fortune that began to plague the overseer alone. His horse bucked without warning, throwing him into the dirt. Tools slipped from his grip or snapped in ways that made no logical sense. Doors he shut were found open minutes later. Windows he latched rattled violently at night, as if hands were banging against them. Those who were closest to him swore that they saw him wake in the middle of the night and sit upright in bed, his chest rising and falling too fast, his eyes scanning the darkness as if someone, or something, had whispered directly into his ear. He stopped patrolling the quarters after sundown, unwilling to walk past Eli's window for reasons he refused to acknowledge. And though he never admitted it aloud, there were moments when he felt watched by eyes that knew him far too well. Through all of this, Eli remained quiet, moving through his days with the same unsettling calm as always, showing no sign that he noticed the overseer unraveling. But the boy's silence carried a weight that grew heavier each time he crossed paths with him. The workers began to avoid being near the two at the same time, sensing the invisible current that passed between them, a tension that was no longer just fear, but something darker taking shape beneath the surface. The overseer tried to convince himself that the unease eating at him was imagined, that the strange events were mere coincidence, but deep down he felt a truth clawing at the edge of his mind. Something had awakened, and it had chosen him as its target, and every time he met Eli's unblinking, steady gaze, he felt that truth creeping closer, as if the boy was not simply looking at him but looking through him, seeing the cracks forming long before the overseer realized how close he was to breaking. The boy's quiet nature had always made him blend into the background, but over time that stillness took on a new meaning, one that unsettled those who paid attention. He moved with a calmness that felt too controlled for a child his age, as if he were listening to something no one else could hear. Workers would speak to him, ask if he was hungry or tired, and he would simply nod without a word. It wasn't shyness, it was awareness, a heavy sort of knowing that made adults fall silent in his presence. They could not name what felt off about him, only that his silence seemed to grow heavier the more the overseer tried to break him. Instead of becoming weaker, Eli became quieter, more deliberate, almost as though every punishment carved deeper into something inside him that wasn't fear, but clarity. His eyes changed too, still calm, still observant, but with a depth that made even the bravest workers look away. There were nights when Eli sat alone by the dying embers of the cooking fires, staring into the fading glow long after others had gone to sleep. Some said they heard him humming, a low, rhythm-like pattern with no words, rising and falling like a chant carried from a distant place. The old women whispered that his quietness wasn't emptiness but a vessel for something growing inside him. They recognized signs they had prayed never to see again, the way animals avoided his path, the way the air felt colder when he stepped into a room, the way shadows seemed to gather near him when dusk settled. They kept their distance, not out of fear of Eli himself, but fear of whatever had chosen to anchor itself to him. They tried to warn the overseer through hints and signs, but the man only laughed and tightened his grip on authority, blind to the dark shift happening right under his gaze. Eli's awareness extended beyond people. He sensed things before they happened. When tempers flared, he would step away just moments before someone was struck. When storms were coming, he'd lift his head first, sniff the air, and move to shelter, even if the sky was clear. His instincts were sharp in a way that didn't feel learned but innate, as if he had been born listening to something the world usually kept hidden. The workers roamed in groups at night, yet Eli walked alone with no hint of fear, drifting through the quarters like he knew nothing could touch him without consequence. Even the overseer noticed how the boy was always where he least expected him, standing at the edge of the fields or leaning quietly near the storage sheds, always watching, never speaking. The man began snapping at him for appearing suddenly, accusing him of sneaking, but Eli never defended himself. He simply tilted his head with that unsettling stillness that felt less like innocence and more like a silent observation of the overseer's unraveling. Rumors spread that the boy had dreams different from others, dreams that made him wake before dawn and sit still as stone in front of his cabin, eyes unfocused, lips barely parted as if in conversation with something unseen. Workers noticed that he often returned from the forest with strange symbols traced into the dirt near his footsteps, spirals and lines that no one taught him. They noticed how his presence made the younger children cling to their mothers, unsure why they felt uneasy. Eli was not cruel and never raised his voice, yet his aura radiated a kind of quiet power that demanded distance. Even nature seemed to shift around him. Birds stopped singing when he passed, insects went silent, and the wind paused as if waiting for him to move first. That unnatural harmony amplified the growing suspicion that the boy's awareness was not a simple quirk of personality, but a sign of something deeper awakening. The overseer, who once viewed Eli as insignificant, began to feel those silent eyes following him like a shadow he could never escape. Every time he turned, the boy was there. Never close, never threatening, just watching, studying, absorbing. At first the overseer tried to assert dominance, barking orders louder whenever Eli was near, but the lack of reaction unsettled him more than defiance ever could. It felt as if the boy could see through the bluster, straight into the man's fear, peeling it apart silently. The overseer would catch himself wiping sweat from his brow whenever Eli lingered nearby, though the air had grown cold. He found himself avoiding the boy's gaze without understanding why. Something about that quiet presence pressed against his mind, pulling at buried guilt, amplifying every dark thought he tried to bury. And though the overseer could not yet name it, he sensed that Eli's silence was no longer just silence. It was the beginning of something rising from deep within him, an awareness sharpened by suffering and shaped by forces that did not belong to the ordinary world. The nights on the plantation had always carried their own kind of unease, but after the overseer's cruelty reached its peak, something shifted so profoundly that even the bravest workers refused to step outside after dusk. It began with small, almost dismissible disturbances, rustling in the fields when there was no wind, the quiet scrape of something dragging across the ground, faint taps along the cabin walls that stopped the moment anyone tried to investigate. People told themselves it was animals, maybe raccoons or wandering dogs, but deep down they felt something different, something colder moving through the dark. The strange events were not random. They clustered around the overseer's path, following him like an invisible trail. And each night the air grew heavier, thick with a tension that made it difficult to breathe, as though the plantation itself was holding everyone in place, waiting for something to unfold. The whispers began soon after. Workers claimed they heard soft footsteps circling their cabins long after the fires had died down, footsteps too light to be an adult's, but too slow to belong to a child at play. The sound came in steady patterns, pausing at windows, lingering at doors, as if whatever walked the darkness was choosing whom to observe. Some swore the footsteps stopped exactly where the moonlight hit, as though the presence avoided being seen. Then came the voices, low, distant echoes that had no clear words, rising and falling like chanting carried by a wind that should not have existed in the summer heat. The older workers tried to explain it away, saying the mind played tricks when fear took root, but their trembling hands betrayed their doubt. No one wanted to admit the truth forming silently inside them. Something was moving through the night, and it was searching. Livestock began disappearing next, vanishing without a trace. Chickens were taken without feathers left behind. Pigs went missing though the gates were secure, and horses that had been calm their entire lives suddenly refused to enter the barn after sunset, pulling away frantically whenever they sensed something the humans could not. Their eyes would widen, nostrils flaring, their bodies trembling as if they could feel an unseen presence standing in the darkness beside them. Tools left outside were found snapped in half by morning, not cut or broken by force, but twisted in ways that made no sense. Workers whispered theories among themselves, predators, thieves, perhaps even spirits, but the overseer dismissed everything with a harsh laugh. Yet even he could not deny the cold that seeped into the air whenever he walked past the empty pens, the way the silence of the animals felt like a warning, not a coincidence. Soon the strange events centered almost entirely around the overseer. He began waking at night to the sound of faint breathing near his window, though no figures stood outside when he lit his lantern. Doors he had locked earlier in the evening were mysteriously open by morning. His boots, placed neatly by his bedside, were sometimes found filled with dirt or mud, as if someone had worn them to walk across the fields and returned them before he woke. He started sleeping with a weapon by his side, but not even that eased the growing panic that crawled under his skin. Shadows seemed to move differently around him, longer, deeper, shifting at the edge of his vision whenever Eli was near. Every sudden noise made him jump, and every quiet moment made his heartbeat stutter because silence had become far more terrifying than sound. And through all of this, Eli never spoke, never explained, never acknowledged the growing fear that wrapped itself around the plantation like a suffocating fog. But the workers noticed that the boy often appeared near the scenes of these disturbances, standing just outside the glow of lantern light, his expression unreadable. The more the unnatural events escalated, the more Eli's presence seemed to carry a strange weight, as if the shadows bent slightly toward him rather than away. The workers kept their distance, terrified not of Eli himself, but of what followed him in the night. And as the overseer's panic deepened, the whispers grew louder. Maybe the land was finally pushing back. Maybe the boy's suffering had awakened something ancient. Or maybe, just maybe, the darkness that haunted the fields was not haunting the plantation at all, but hunting a single man who had run out of time to escape. The shift from fear to panic within the overseer was not sudden. It unfolded slowly, like a tightly coiled rope unraveling strand by strand until nothing held him together. At first he tried to mask his unease with anger, barking louder orders, striking harder, moving with a frantic energy that fooled no one. The workers watched from a distance, seeing his hands tremble when he thought no one could see. His face grew gaunt, his eyes darting toward corners and shadows, as if expecting something to leap out at any moment. The authority he once flaunted began to crumble, not because anyone defied him, but because he was no longer certain he controlled anything. Not the land, not the workers, and certainly not the growing presence that followed him like a relentless breath against his neck. Each day, he felt himself slipping deeper into a fear he could not name, a fear that etched itself into his bones. The first time he realized he was being hunted, it was nearly dawn, and he had stumbled outside. unable to sleep after another night of invisible footsteps pacing around his cabin. The sky was still dark, and the air had an unnatural stillness, as if even the wind refused to stir. As he walked toward the barn, he saw something move in the corner of his eye, a shadow smaller than a man, silent, gliding across the path before disappearing behind the storage sheds. He froze, his breath catching, listening for any sound that could explain what he had seen. But there was nothing. Not a cricket, not a rustle of leaves, not even the distant lowing of cattle. That silence, the crushing weight of it, was worse than any noise. He felt watched, not from a distance but from mere feet away, as if something was waiting for him to take one more step. When he finally turned back toward his cabin, he felt that cold stare on his spine with every movement. As days passed, his behavior grew erratic. He began checking over his shoulder constantly, even in broad daylight. Tools dropped from his hands if Eli walked past, the boy's calm expression twisting the overseer's already frayed nerves until he could barely speak without stuttering. Workers noticed him muttering under his breath, offering apologies to no one, whispering curses at shadows that never answered back. Sometimes he would snap at the empty air, demanding that whoever or whatever followed him reveal itself. Other times, he would fall completely silent, staring off into nothing with wide, terrified eyes, as if he saw something hovering just beyond the mortal world. The fear that once belonged solely to the enslaved had now lodged itself deeply into him, hollowing him out until he resembled a man who had not slept in weeks, whose sanity hung by the thinnest of threads. By the time true panic took hold, the overseer no longer tried to hide it. He stopped going into the fields alone. He refused to walk past the quarters after sunset. He insisted that the workers keep their lanterns lit longer than necessary, though he never explained why. Every night, he barricaded his door with whatever he could drag across the floor: chairs, crates, sacks of grain, and sat with his back pressed against it, clutching his weapon so tightly his knuckles turned white. But no matter how many barriers he built, he still heard the footsteps outside, slow, deliberate, circling his cabin with the patience of something that knew he could not hide forever. Sometimes the steps paused directly outside his door, and he would hold his breath, certain he could feel the presence leaning in, listening to the frantic beat of his heart through the walls. And always, always, when he finally gathered the courage to look out his window, he saw the same thing: Eli, standing at a distance, motionless, watching him with that same eerie calm that had haunted him since the beginning. The boy did not move toward him, did not threaten him, did not say a single word. He simply watched, and it was that silence, utter, absolute, and unbroken, that finally shattered whatever remained of the overseer's confidence. He realized then that he was no longer the one holding power. It was Eli who now carried an unseen force behind him, a force that shifted the very air around the plantation, turning the hunter into the hunted. And as the overseer's fear grew into full-blown terror, he understood that something had already marked him, something patient and merciless, something that would follow him through every shadow until the final moment he had long feared but could no longer escape. The final days of the overseer's unraveling brought a shift so profound that even the land seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if every root, every leaf, every grain of soil recognized that the end of something long feared was approaching. The workers moved quietly through their tasks, avoiding eye contact, speaking only in whispers, because they sensed an invisible current running beneath everything, a tension that tightened the air and made it feel charged, almost electric. Even the sky looked different, grayer despite the heat, as though a storm hovered just beyond sight. And at the center of it all was Eli, calm as ever, drifting through the plantation with a presence that made people step aside without thinking. No one dared approach him now. Even the bravest among them felt a weight pressing on their chest when he passed, a silent warning carried by something more ancient than pain. They knew something was coming, though none could describe it. The boy's stillness had transformed from unsettling to almost prophetic, as if he were merely waiting for the moment that fate would pull tight the final thread. The overseer, meanwhile, existed in a constant state of dread, unable to rest, unable to eat, unable to think clearly. Each night he paced the floor of his cabin, lantern flickering weakly in the darkness, casting trembling shadows across his face. His mind had become a labyrinth of paranoia, every creak of the floorboards a threat, every whisper of wind a reminder he was not alone. He had once ruled the plantation with unchecked brutality, but that authority had dissolved completely. leaving behind a hollow shell of a man who flinched at his own reflection. He felt watched at all hours, especially when no one was near. Sometimes he caught glimpses of movement, small, quick flashes, just at the edge of his vision, but when he turned, there was only empty air. Those moments chipped away at him until reality itself felt unstable, bending around the fear that chewed through his thoughts like a slow-moving fire. The confrontation he dreaded most did not begin with violence, but with silence. Long, heavy, suffocating silence. It settled around him during a dusk that came too early, shadows stretching unnaturally across the ground as though pulled by invisible hands. He was walking from the barn when he sensed it. The feeling of being followed, not by footsteps, but by a presence that pressed against his back like an icy breath. He turned slowly, and there he saw Eli at the far end of the path, standing perfectly still, his face unreadable, his eyes darker than the evening sky. The overseer tried to speak, tried to shout, tried to reclaim even the smallest shred of authority, but no sound left his throat. His voice had deserted him, swallowed by the very fear he once enjoyed inflicting on others. And as Eli took one quiet step forward, the overseer stumbled backward as if struck by an invisible force, his heartbeat thunderous in his ears, his knees weakening under the weight of pure, consuming terror. The world around them seemed to shift with every step Eli took. The wind changed direction, swirling around the boy, but never touching him. The distant trees groaned softly, branches swaying though no breeze should have reached them. Even the insects, normally loud at dusk, went silent. It was as if nature itself paused to witness what was unfolding. The overseer backed away, tripping over a loose stone and falling into the dirt, scrambling backward with shaking hands. His breath came in ragged gasps as he stared at Eli, who continued to advance at the same calm, steady pace. There was no anger in the boy's face, no satisfaction, no malice, only that heavy, unblinking stillness that had haunted the overseer from the start. And somehow that made it worse. Rage he could have fought, tears he could have dismissed, but this quiet certainty, this cold inevitability, broke him in a way no physical blow ever could. By the time the confrontation reached its final moment, the overseer was no longer a man. He was terror made flesh, reduced to desperate, mindless panic as he crawled backward across the ground, pleading with a voice that barely sounded human. But Eli did not react. He simply stood over him, watching with those ancient, depthless eyes, as if he were not a child at all, but a vessel for something that had waited far too long for justice. The workers, though hidden behind the cabins and shadows, witnessed fragments of the scene, hearing the overseer's choked cries cut through the night air. They knew the boy had become more than a figure of suffering. He had become a force that could not be resisted, a presence that turned cruelty back on its source with calm inevitability. And as the final cry of the overseer faded into the stillness, the plantation held its breath, the darkness settling heavily over the land like a curtain drawn over a chapter that could never be spoken aloud again.